When I was 24, I moved to a small mountain town in Colorado for work. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and most locals lived far apart in isolated cabins or small homes nestled deep in the woods. My job was seasonal, so I rented a small A-frame cabin just outside of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a living room, a tiny kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. It was surrounded by dense forest and accessible by a narrow dirt road that was barely wide enough for one car. I'd always wanted a place where I could be off the grid, and this seemed like the perfect escape. The first few weeks went by without incident. I worked during the day and spent my evenings reading or hiking in the woods behind the cabin. Occasionally, I'd hear strange sounds at night, branches snapping, the crunch of leaves, but I figured it was just the local wildlife. I even saw a black bear once from my window. One evening, after a late shift at work, I came home to find something strange on my front porch. A single pine cone, perfectly centered on the welcome mat. It wouldn't have seemed odd if it weren't for how deliberate it looked. I brushed it off, thinking it might have fallen from the tree above, and went inside. The next night, there was another pine cone in the exact same spot. This time, I felt a little uneasy. I didn't have any neighbors nearby, and no one at work would have gone out of their way to play a prank on me. Still, I told myself it was probably a squirrel or some animal. But by the third night, the pine cone was accompanied by something else. A small, hand-carved wooden figurine of a man. It was crude but unmistakable, and it was sitting right next to the pine cone on the mat. My unease turned into outright fear. Someone had to have left it there, and the thought of someone creeping around my cabin at night made my skin crawl. I decided to call the local sheriff's office. The deputy who came out was a middle-aged guy named Hank. He had the kind of laid-back demeanor that small-town cops often have. He inspected the figurine, nodded, and said, "Yeah, that's weird all right, but it's probably just some kid messing with you. We'll keep an eye out." That didn't reassure me much, but I nodded and thanked him. Hank offered to drive by the area at night, but I knew he probably wouldn't. There wasn't much crime in this town, and I doubted my little pinecone problem would be high on his priority list. The next few nights, nothing happened. No pine cones, no figurines, no signs of anyone near the cabin. I started to relax and convince myself that it really had been some dumb prank. But then, one night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. My bedroom loft had a small window that overlooked the front porch, and I crept over to it as quietly as I could. I peeked out, expecting to see some teenager, or maybe even a bear. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. A man was standing on my porch, staring at my front door. He was tall and thin, with long, stringy hair that hung over his face. He was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't tell what it was. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. Then, as if he could sense me watching, he slowly turned his head and looked directly up at the loft window. I dropped to the floor. I scrambled for my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was on my property. She said a deputy would be there as soon as possible, but given how remote my cabin was, I knew it would take a while. Meanwhile, I could hear the man moving around outside. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, crunching on the gravel and leaves. At one point, I heard a soft tapping on the living room window below. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. When the deputy finally arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything except for a single pine cone, placed neatly on the porch railing. The next day, I packed up and moved into a motel in town. I told my boss I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore, and thankfully they understood. I never went back, not even to collect the rest of my things. The sheriff's office never found out who the man was or why he was stalking me. Sometimes I wonder if it was really just some drifter passing through. But other times I think about the pine cones, the figurines, and the way he looked up at that window, like he knew I was there all along. This happened during my last summer before starting college. I had a part-time job at a small, family-run grocery store in our quiet little town. It wasn't anything glamorous, but it gave me some spending money, and I didn't mind the work. My shifts were usually in the afternoon, but one evening my manager asked if I could stay late and close up. He had a family emergency, and I agreed. I figured a few extra hours wouldn't hurt. By 9:30 p.m., the store was empty, and I started the usual closing routine, sweeping the aisles, restocking the shelves, and locking the doors. I wasn't nervous about being there alone. It was a small town, and nothing ever happened. I locked the front doors at 10 o'clock sharp, flipped the open sign to closed, and went to the back office to count the register and finish up. While I was sitting at the desk, I heard a faint noise, a soft thud, like something had fallen. It wasn't unusual for things to shift on the shelves, so I ignored it. But a few seconds later, I heard it again, this time closer. It sounded like it came from one of the aisles. I froze, staring at the office door. I knew for a fact I had locked the front doors. Maybe someone had stayed inside after closing, hidden in one of the aisles. My heart started to race. Grabbing my phone, I quietly dialed the store's landline number to see if the phone at the register would ring. If it didn't, I'd know someone had unplugged it. When the line connected, I heard the phone out front start to ring. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I hung up and went back to the register to grab my bag, eager to get out of there. As I walked into the front of the store, I glanced down the aisles, and that's when I noticed something strange. One of the lights near the back was flickering. Nothing too unusual, but what caught my attention was the shadow. There was a shadow on the floor that didn't match any of the shelves or displays. It looked like the outline of a person, standing perfectly still. I felt my stomach drop. I slowly backed up toward the front doors, fumbling in my pocket for the keys. My plan was to unlock the door and make a run for it. But when I turned around, I saw that the deadbolt was already unlocked. My hands shook as I tried to twist the lock back into place. That's when I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps, coming toward me from the back of the store. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the aisle in front of me was empty. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then I heard something even worse. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, coming from somewhere close. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing, and then I saw it. Just out of the corner of my eye, a figure darted between the shelves, moving toward me. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the parking lot. I didn't even look back. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, but I wasn't going to risk trying to get to it. Instead, I ran straight for the gas station across the street, where I knew someone would still be working. The clerk at the gas station must have seen the panic on my face because he immediately asked if I was okay. I could barely get the words out as I told him someone was in the store. He called the police, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived and went inside to check it out. They didn't find anyone. The store was empty, and nothing was out of place except for one thing. The back door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, was wide open. They told me it was probably just a homeless person looking for a place to stay, but I wasn't convinced. Whoever it was had been deliberately hiding, and the way they moved it felt like they were playing some kind of game. I quit that job the next day. I told my manager what had happened, and while he apologized profusely, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in the store that night wasn't just passing through. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. And sometimes I wonder if they ever found a new hiding place. I grew up in a small New England town nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place where cell service is spotty, and the only light after dark comes from the occasional porch lamp or headlights bouncing off tall pines. My best friend, Tyler, lives even deeper into the forest, about 15 minutes from town, on a gravel road that dead ends at his family's sprawling old colonial farmhouse. Every year, his family hosts a small gathering for close friends and family to celebrate New Year's Eve. I've gone every year since high school, and it's always a relaxed, cozy night. This year, the temperature had plummeted to single digits. Snow clung to the sides of the roads, and the icy patches on the gravel were nearly impossible to see in the dim moonlight. I had taken my old sedan, which wasn't exactly built for these roads, but I didn't want to miss the party. As I made my way down the last stretch toward Tyler's house, I noticed something odd. There was an old rusted camper parked just off the road. I didn't remember it being there before. The windows were dark, and the whole thing seemed abandoned, but something about it made my stomach twist. I shook it off and arrived at Tyler's without incident. The party was small as usual. We played board games, drank cider, and counted down to midnight. Around 1 a.m., most of the guests had left, and I decided it was time to head home. Tyler offered to let me crash on the couch, but I figured I'd rather sleep in my own bed. The drive back was uneventful at first, the gravel crunching under my tires as my headlights sliced through the darkness. But as I neared the spot where I'd seen the camper earlier, I noticed something even more unsettling. A light was on inside the camper now. A weak, flickering glow. I slowed down, unable to stop myself from glancing at it as I passed. A shadow moved across the window. My stomach sank and I pressed the gas, eager to put distance between myself and that camper. About a mile later, the car jolted violently, and a sickening thump echoed through the night. My dashboard lit up with a flat tire warning. Swearing under my breath, I pulled over to the shoulder and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. I debated whether to drive on the rim, but I could already hear the grinding of metal against gravel. Reluctantly, I grabbed the flashlight from my glove box and stepped out into the frigid night. The cold bit at my exposed skin as I crouched to inspect the tires. The rear passenger tire was shredded, not punctured but slashed, with long, jagged cuts that didn't look like they came from debris. A sudden noise made me freeze. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of snow, like a footstep. I swung my flashlight toward the woods but saw nothing. The beam of light barely penetrated the thick pines. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No response. I quickly decided I wasn't sticking around to find out what, or who, was out there. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me, and tried to start the engine. It sputtered but didn't turn over. My heart pounded as I tried again, but it was no use. The car was dead. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the side mirror. Something, or someone, was standing just beyond the reach of the taillights, their silhouette barely visible in the dark. I couldn't make out any features, but they were tall, with unnaturally long limbs that hung at odd angles. They didn't move closer, just stood there, watching. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the car into complete darkness. My breathing was ragged, loud in the suffocating silence. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. It was impossible to tell. Then came the sound. A slow, deliberate tapping on the driver's side window. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The tapping continued, rhythmic and patient, as if whoever, or whatever was out there knew I had nowhere to go. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage I had, I turned my flashlight back on and aimed it at the window. Nothing. The tapping had stopped, and the space outside was empty. My relief was short-lived. As I lowered the flashlight, the beam caught something in the rearview mirror, a face peering into the back window. It wasn't human. Its skin was stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, and its eyes were hollow black pits. Its mouth was open, unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I screamed, throwing myself into the passenger seat and fumbling with the door handle. I tumbled out into the snow, landing hard on my side, and scrambled to my feet. The thing didn't chase me. It just watched, its head tilting as I staggered away. I ran down the road, not daring to look back. When I finally saw the faint glow of a porch light in the distance, I nearly collapsed with relief. It was a neighbor's house, and they let me in without question after seeing the state I was in. The police came later that night to tow my car. They didn't find anyone or anything around it, but they did find something else. Scratched into the metal of the driver's side door were 3 words. "I know you. I don't drive that road anymore."